All right, thank you everybody for your time today. This session is called Achieving Your Ideal State, Strategies for State Compliance Automation in ONESOURCE. With you today are Nate Patterson and Zubin Patel. I am a senior manager with our tax ignition practice based in Seattle, Washington. I have spent 15 years with KPMG and have worked with clients of pretty much every size and complexity. I have a bachelor's degree in accounting and economics and a master's degree in tax accounting from the University of Washington in Seattle, and I'm a licensed CPA in Washington and California.
Hi everyone, my name is Zubin Patel and I am a senior manager in our tax group in Atlanta. I am also a CPA and I have experience from federal to state tax return review and preparation. Recently, I've been helping advise clients and internal teams on our technology use and integration and just doing overall technology process reviews to make sure that we're fully integrated and using technologies to the best of the ability for particular engagements.
All right. Just a couple of notes on logistics and CPE information. This session has been pre-recorded. However, your two presenters will be participating in the session live to make sure we answer questions using the Q&A panel. Throughout the session, to verify your attendance and qualify you for CPE credit, please ensure that you acknowledge all attendance pop-up alerts. In addition, please be sure to complete the session survey to provide us with valuable feedback. We do read it very closely and use that as an opportunity to improve both the content and the messaging, so very much appreciated. CPE credits for attending the session live will be added to your Synergy CPE certificate, and that will be emailed to you following the conference. The recording of the session will also be available post-Synergy, but will not qualify for CPE credit. So just a note on the objectives. Upon completion, attendees will be able to identify methods to use automation for state compliance in ONESOURCE Income Tax and ONESOURCE State Apportionment. You will also have an understanding and awareness of how other enabling technologies like Alteryx can be used throughout the state compliance process to automate and improve your use of data. All right, just a quick note on the agenda. We are going to start off by discussing native OIT functionality and batch functionality. This includes items like state apportionment and allocation and state modification charts and work papers in OIT. This also includes ONESOURCE work papers and data connection, also known as tax return import and export. We'll go into some depth for each of these topics. We'll then discuss ONESOURCE State Apportionment and the capabilities that it possesses as an apportionment engine and where we might see that fit into a solution architecture around state compliance. And then finally, we'll talk about Alteryx and how it can be used for data standardization and manipulation and give some ideas and thoughts around how it can be used throughout your state tax life cycle. Okay.
All right, so the native OIT functionality. We will be discussing the state apportionment and allocation, state taxable income work papers, as well as the batch processing that are all native to OIT. For state allocation and apportionment, our state ANA, there are charts available in OIT that will give the user the ability to automate certain pieces of their ANA and basically have a global approach mindset for how ANA gets pushed into the organizer. The pieces that we'll be talking about are going to be focused on how the charts then will be used and then integrate into the organizer. So we'll start off with the state ANA categories. What the categories allows a user to do is to create a custom apportionment subcategory to push data into a state form, and it also allows the user to control the logic for that custom apportionment subcategory. So for example, we typically create custom apportionment subcategories for if there's two service streams and we need to separate those two service revenue streams into two different categories and apply different logic to those particular categories. Where we get into the logic is there's a chart called the state A&A logic. What this logic chart essentially does is allows a user to define what's included or excluded from a particular state. So in the first case, we had a category that we either is system defined or it's a custom category. The next step would be to use the logic chart to control what flows to your actual return. And this would be set up and applied across the board. So think of applying a standardized set of logic across all entities that you have, and you have consistency across the board. And this logic essentially allows you to say what's included, excluded, if you need to update something, including your numerator only, denominator only. All those options are available, and we'll take a look at a screenshot in a bit. The last piece of the state A&A section is our forms presentation, also known as our forms cross-reference. So we created our categories, or we use the standard categories. We've now used the logic chart to dictate what's included in our states, to say these are the categories that are going to be included. And the forms presentation now comes into play if we want to change where that particular category hits on a form line. So if we think of a particular state form, let's think to that A&A section on the state form. What this functionality allows us to do is control whether or not we want a particular A&A category to flow to a different section on that state form. So there's a default available, but this allows us the option to move some of that around depending on the presentation that's needed. And we'll walk through a screenshot here. So in the screenshot, you'll see what we really wanted to highlight was the logic chart, which is the logic chart as the screenshot at the top. And then the forms cross-reference is the screenshot at the bottom. So the logic chart, as we talked about, controls whether or not we're including or excluding a category from apportionments. So for example, in Alabama, we're including leasehold improvements, but we're not including the accumulated amortization associated with those leasehold improvements. That can be updated. This is the default logic that Thompson has put out there, but this can always be updated if client facts and circumstances dictate. The bottom section is our forms cross-reference. Again, this is just saying where on the form you want this particular category to fall into place. At the top of that section, you'll see there's a tax return presentation. And the Alabama form, there's a line called buildings and leasehold improvements, and these are where those categories would fall in based on how the forms cross-reference was set up. We'll now move over to our state taxable income, and within OIT again, this native functionality, there exists a couple of charts for state taxable income. There's the state TI categories, and this allows again for the creation of modification categories. This modification category would then be mapped to a particular return line. So in order to do this, we would go into our first step of creating a modification category, setting that up, and then we would move over to the second chart, which is our state TI forms mapping. Within the state TI forms mapping, we would then take the category that we had created, and then we would map that over to a particular return line, and that would make that modification flow to that particular line of the return when you get data into TAS, your tax accounting system, or from TAS into the organizer, you'll see where that flows onto that particular return. There are specific forms that can be imported through Excel add-in or manually entered, and also some potential to use data connection, which we'll talk a little bit about later on in this discussion. If we go to the next slide, you'll see here where we try to highlight the categories. So in the first screenshot at the top, you'll see we have the categories where we have a depreciation adjustment category. And then in the forms mapping is where we're telling the system where we want that particular depreciation adjustment to hit on the state return line. All right, so there are some considerations to take into account when using some of this native OIT functionality. The cost, there is no cost to users, since both of these TI charts and ANA charts are included with your OIT license. The capabilities are that you can import a lot of this data in batch. So think of a global approach in terms of doing a lot of this information, controlling your logic across the board where you're not going to have different entities with different ANA factors in the same state, or different ANA computations in a state, or modification flowing to different lines for different entities for a particular state. It allows you for that batch import, control items globally, and there are particular reports available within the tax accounting screens that can be used to also export and review the data that's been pushed. The limitations for this are the detail forms. We talked a bit about that, where those, if not available within Excel add-in, they would have to be manually entered. There are, again, options to do this using data connection that we'll talk about. And then cities are not supported using these charts. So ANA cities can't be pushed using the native functionality right now with Excel add-in, or with the charts to control the logic. And then same with the modifications, there's no specific cities associated with those. But again, there are alternatives to cities that we will talk about in a little bit. We're now going to get to our first polling question. So our first polling question is, how many of you have used state charts in OIT? A, you've used state ANA charts. B, state TI work papers. C, you've used both. Or D, neither. And we'll give you guys some time to respond. Again, please, if you're attending this session live, please make sure to respond to these questions to make sure that you receive your full CPE credit.
Okay, great. Zubin, just maybe one comment as we're talking through this. In terms of using the native OIT functionality around apportionment and state modifications, why are we talking about that when we're talking about automation? I know that we've kind of talked about there's there's no additional cost other than setting up the charts. Would you consider this as part of kind of a solution architecture for a client? And I'm just kind of curious. A lot of times we hear a lot of other ways to approach these problems.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. It is, think of it from a solution architect standpoint. We talk about these charts based off of how they impact population of the return. So if we think of the current process of how we're populating these returns, there are alternatives to populating information on these returns, and using the native functionality of charts gives us a higher benefit and higher degree of control in terms of how we process and get information onto those forms. The ANA charts in particular allow us to control pushing data in bulk into TAS and then into the organizer. The logic chart allows us to control at a group level across multiple entities what our apportionment logic should be in a particular state, and thinking of this through the lens of client-specific facts and circumstances as well, setting that up and applying that and getting that consistent approach across the board. The same can be said for state modifications, where we're setting up these charts, and it's a one-time setup where you map out where your modifications are going to hit on a particular form line. There are, of course, modifications that are automatically populated on those state forms, but doing these through the charts allows the user more control and visibility into knowing what is actually supposed to show up on the form. And you, again, get that consistency across all entities in terms of how stuff is pushing through. So definitely thinking this through a lens of what is the current process of how information is put into the form. And then two, do you have that consistency across the board? And, thinking through, are all your state, all your separate state filings presented consistently when you're doing a combined return, or are your details items also presented consistently, everything computed consistently? That's kind of the lens I would take a look at it.
Sure. Yep. And the only thing I would add, to those considerations is really kind of a question of governance. And this gives you, built into OIT, consistency. It allows you to control in a very organized and very repeatable way, presentation, but also the data as it comes in and the data as it comes out of the system. And so, very, very much agree with you, Zubin. When I approach a state automation conversation with a client, I usually start by walking through these for the reasons you've articulated. Let's start with kind of what oftentimes is a good core of the solution for many clients, and let's kind of talk through those and see if those might fit. There definitely are some other options and other things to think about, and we'll talk about those here shortly. But these are such stable and well-established aspects of ONESOURCE functionality that I always prefer to start with these as part of our discussion.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. So next, we're going to continue on the path of some more native functionality within OIT. We're going to focus a little bit on our batch processing. So batch processing, many of you may have seen some of the batch processing items already, but what batch processing allows us to do is to control items in batch, as the name indicates. If we take a group of entities, we're essentially setting that same option potentially for state at that group level. We're applying that same, we talked about consistency and the global approach and having that consistency across entity to entity. This is what batch processing allows us to do. It allows us to set an option at the batch level, allows us to apply that consistently across the board. So if there's a checkbox that's needed, we don't need to go binder by binder to input that. We can go through the process of going into our batch processing screen, selecting those checkboxes and applying that across the board. That really, there is no reason to avoid batch processing because this will allow the user to, again, do items in group and do it in batch and get that consistency across the board. There are some considerations to take into account with batch processing. If an option is selected and applied to a group of entities, it can't be undone. You would have to go binder by binder to uncheck something or to remove an option that may have been set by batch. So definitely keep that in mind as you're going through these batch processing screens and applying items in batch, just to make sure that you know what you need to apply and you're applying it to the correct state. The other items, there are some options to pull out reporting through tax accounting system. We talked about that a little bit, where there's some canned reports that you can already pull out from the tax accounting system. Alternatively, there is a ONESOURCE data query tool available that is separately licensed, but it does allow you to pull out information in those batches, to pull it out by specific binders, by specific tax years, and you can filter and sort through data that way. That is a different tool that is licensed separately with ONESOURCE and Thomson Reuters. The picture that we're going to see next, or the screenshot that we're going to see next, is going to be of that batch process screen. Again, in particular, there are a lot of options within this screen. There's a state option section within the launch work paper tab in the middle, and this will allow you to set those checkbox options for states. And then there's also some enterprise control level options that you can set as well to control city or state activation, for example, or setting up of charts in batch as well.
I would just add to this, Zubin, I was thinking about states as they go to unitary or combined filing, and New Jersey is a great example. The ability to push out return options in batch, either in this section or from within a consolidation binder, and the ability to use the combined return options and push that down is something that I think is often underappreciated. If you have to select a checkbox, if you only have one entity with nexus in New Jersey and everybody else is kind of not subject to the minimum fee, for example, pushing that checkbox out in batch, especially if you have a larger consolidation, is a very good use case and a very easy way to ease into understanding and becoming comfortable with the functionality.
Yep. All right. Our next slide is some more native OIT functionality, and we'll hand it over to you, Nate.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to talk at this point about two different Excel-based toolbars or add-ins. One of these, the data import Excel add-in, or commonly just the Excel add-in, has been around for quite some time. It is import only, and it allows you to import your state apportionment and your modification data as kind of a tie-in from our earlier chart conversation, as well as state payment information. So very good as a baseline, and whenever, again, we look at a process for a client, this is usually one of the first questions I ask. Have you looked at the data import add-in? Have you tried to use it? And oftentimes we do find that people are either not familiar with it, or at the point in time when they first looked at it, it wasn't, it didn't seem like it was applicable or it would add value. But we oftentimes find that trying to use this is a good first step in embracing some automation with data push into OIT. The one notable caveat about data import, at this point, new fields and forms are not being added. So with tax reform, there were a couple of changes to existing international schedules, for example, but Thomson is not actively updating the data import add-in. There is another Excel-based toolbar called ONESOURCE Work Papers. This is newer. This was enabled for the 2018 year. First and foremost, this opens the door for us to introduce both import and export capabilities with an Excel-based process. So just a really big step forward. Again, very much a newer toolbar, and one that is being built out on an ongoing basis. A couple of comments on this. One, this is primarily going to be useful for forms that are not currently populated by the tax accounting system, and that's in the current state. I do suspect over time that we will start to see more of the data import functionality being integrated into ONESOURCE Work Papers, but in its current state, you will see a lot of import targets in work papers that you would not typically see. So a lot of city apportionment information, for example, is one very common use case for work papers. In addition, pushing into the common state selections area and pushing, kind of pulling that information out is another common use case. What I like about this too is that this allows integration of other return data into your state process. And so a very common example is when you're gathering your apportionment data, you need to reconcile that to your federal return. And so, pulling that information out, there are a couple of ways to do it. We've already touched on some of those, using reports out of the tax accounting system, or using reports out of Data Query, the report writer. Another way you could do that is to use ONESOURCE work papers and actually pull numbers off of page 1 of the federal return and incorporate that in a very straightforward, very simple fashion into your reconciliation. And so a lot of times what we're starting to see and kind of transitioning from maybe functionality-based conversation to starting to think about how you might approach automation or an architecture for your process is using a combination of ONESOURCE work papers and the data import add-in. And that certainly is possible. And thinking through, you could pull out your return information into a work paper. You could have your native state apportionment information as it's been gathered from the various source systems. You could do a reconciliation, allocating the variances or spread those back out depending on how you decide to do that, and then use the data import add-in to push that information into the tax accounting system. You could then, if you so wished, you could then also then go into OIT, and using the batch area, you could do a batch compute and also make sure that all of your transfer ANA to the organizer selections are chosen. So just kind of throwing out a couple of, a little bit simpler but very tested and true thoughts on process design, using these Excel toolbars. So.
And Nate, one thing I would want to add too is, we've talked about TAS and the organizer. In terms of using some of this native OIT functionality, the thought is you're setting items up to then push data into TAS, which from TAS, once all those items are set up, it will get transferred to the organizer. So there is a very straightforward process in terms of needing to set up particular charts in order to get the data to flow to the organizer. So just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that using this native functionality in the charts and then using the data imports and the batch imports in some instances would require the charts to be set up to make sure that it gets pushed to the organizer.
So that's a very interesting and I think a very pertinent comment, Zubin. One thing I'm thinking about for any calendar year filers who are probably as of the date of this conference are potentially still going through some of their state compliance. One thing I would note as we kind of get into more advanced functionality and other types of solutions is really the time to be thinking about concerns, questions, limitations, pain points throughout the process. Really the time to be thinking about all of that is now. And so even if you're going through the process and it's not, you don't have the time to change something, what we often find is that that's still a good time to start taking notes and really as you're in the heat of the moment, kind of jotting things down. What's hard? Where do you find yourself asking, look, I think there's a better way to do this. We've been on OIT for many years. I thought that this would have been smoother by now. Those sorts of questions, even if you don't know the answer, those sorts of, I think, prompting questions and thoughts are very useful then once the returns are filed and everybody's had kind of a chance to take a breath and kind of step back to then start to look at each of these options and see, where you're experiencing the pain points, and then where it would make sense to invest your time and focus. To Zubin's point about the charts, oftentimes the ideal time to really talk about those, and especially if you have those charts in place, but you think updates are needed, the best time to talk about that is while all this knowledge is fresh in your mind. Oftentimes what I see at least is people will have the charts in place for apportionment or modifications or both, and then we go back in, after extensions are filed, maybe in March and April, and we try to talk about their pain points, and it does become a lot more challenging at that point to really walk through where maybe something wasn't working the way you expected, or wasn't working as well as you expected. So I just wanted to throw that thought out there, and I think it applies with these Excel add-ins as well. Very, very common in my experience for people to have looked at these toolbars, and even though Workpapers is newer, there's been a lot of interest in it, and a lot of, I think, attempts to try and understand how to integrate it. But again, the use cases for this become a little bit harder to articulate the more time passes. And so I would just encourage everybody, as we're talking through this, use your, just take notes as you're going through, your remaining state filings, about where you're seeing problems. And if you're seeing problems with, pushing the data in, or errors on importing, or you're keying information in and you're having data integrity issues, I think that could point to maybe a different focus. Whereas if you're looking at, we got the information in fine, but the presentation across states was not correct, or it wasn't at the right level of detail, we had to override the denominator on, a couple of states. Those all point to me to be in situations where, maybe we look at the charts and the data structure that the charts accompany. And so, again, having that insight, and again, even just high-level bullet points as you're walking through your process real time can be helpful when we go to do an after-action review and look at ways to improve for the coming year. Go ahead, Zubin. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and you just as we talked about the charts, that it's with the data import, the Excel add-in or the batch import is really just the way it's set up and where you're pushing data. Typically, it's going to go to the tax accounting screen and then get transferred down. But Nate will, in here, talk about there is an alternative to that, that we'll talk about in a bit as well. So definitely don't want to scare you guys off with you have to set up all these charts and stuff. But I think there is a benefit to doing it, and it may be a one-time heavy lift at the beginning, but I think the benefits you reap at the end are worth it.
Absolutely. That actually brings us to a very potentially detailed topic. We'll keep it high level for this conversation. But that is the topic of data connection, or tax return import and export, called a couple of different things depending on who you talk to and kind of how you first encounter this. This has actually been around for quite some time. For anybody who's used any of the firm products like Go Systems, you are likely already familiar with this, even if you didn't know it maybe by this name. Really, just in terms of capabilities, this pushes directly to the organizer. So this is, first and foremost useful for forms that are not populated by the tax accounting system. And so when I talk through data connection as part of a solution architecture, I oftentimes start with, what forms are you filing? What detailed forms are you filing in batch, or where you have to fill it out for many different entities within a state combined group, for example, or where do you maybe have a core group of data that you're working with that makes its way to a number of different state forms, but that may not necessarily be touched or able to be populated through the charts and TAS.
And one of the limitations, Nate, we talked about was city apportionment. So how have you used data connection to automate or get some of that data into, those state or city forms? Yep,
that's a great example, Zubin. So, for example, limitation around the charts is that it doesn't push to cities. Well, data connection is a great complement to those charts, and specifically for city information. And so, if you have all of your state and city apportionment data in one place, that gives you the information you need to really fill out those state forms. What I like about data connection in that regard is that, again, if you have everything in one place, you can set up a process to get those forms mapped to your data. and then you can generate this file. And so for those of you who are familiar with diff and cat files, data connection operates in sort of a similar way. You set up a data map. It is a little bit, in my experience, a little bit easier to work with once you have the map and the logic set up. And then you can import directly to the organizer. It is currently still entity by entity, but you can do multiple cities in one file. And so it kind of takes that diff-cat concept and it really kind of evolves it. A very powerful possibility. And one thing that we are observing is that Thomson is enabling more fields for import, specifically for use with data connection. So I think there's a lot of potential here, and there's been a lot of interest in my conversations around state compliance automation. The only thing I would comment here is that it does require more process design around data aggregation and mapping, and then also creating those import files, as well as the reporting on the back end. And so depending on what mix of technologies you use to support your process and how you choose to evolve it, using something like data connection could be a very powerful complement, or depending on your appetite, to kind of dive in and map, a large number of detail fields, for example, it really could be transformative to your process. So there's a lot of potential there, but it does require, a lot more thought. And so oftentimes where I see people using data connection is, again, to Zubin's point, maybe we use it for city apportionment, and we use that to get comfortable around it, make sure our data is organized in such a way that we can do it. And then we'll kind of use that in our process for the current year or for next year. And then once we're comfortable, in how it works, we can look and see what the other use cases are for our, for our particular filing pattern. Zubin, is that fair from what you've seen?
Yep, it is. All right. So we'll go to our next polling question. So the question is, do you currently use data import or ONESOURCE work papers, Excel add-ins, or data connection? A, you use data import. B, ONESOURCE work papers. C, data connection. D, a combination. Or E, none. And we'll give you a little bit of time to answer that.
All right. All right, thank you, everybody. We're going to go ahead and walk through a couple of other enabling technologies in addition to that native functionality. One of those is ONESOURCE State Apportionment, or OSA. So many of you in the audience will likely be familiar with OSA in concept, or probably have looked at this at one point or another. Just in terms of overview, this is a cloud-native apportionment engine that's offered by Thomson Reuters. It has been in place for over a decade, and really it allows you to use your apportionment data across your tax lifecycle. It gives you one place for your apportionment data to be centralized and gathered, and then it gives you the ability to customize your calculations as well as your data structure. And really, some of this is going to be very similar to what you might see within OIT in the tax accounting system, but really gives you additional flexibility, and really allows you to build out a data structure in as much detail as really as you want. And I think crucially, along with that ability to really fully customize your apportionment data structures and your logic, it also allows you to do scenario planning. And so I think that's a very common use case for many people in an area of interest. We have all this apportionment data that we use for our tax returns. Why can't we take this and use this? Use this for planning? Why can't we use this for a tax provision? And so that is one area where having an apportionment engine outside of OIT natively gives you some additional flexibility. OSA also allows you to bring in state modification information and actually lets you set up pro forma kind of estimates of state tax liability. So very useful both for planning, and then we've also seen a lot of interest in OSA around doing estimated payment calculations or as a supplement to other modules. And so the other one item of note that OSA really opens the door for as well is a detailed audit trail and tracking capability. And so it is actually quite remarkable when you look at OSA and how much information it retains as you walk through your apportionment process. It allows you to pinpoint as of a point in time what your apportionment data says, is your factor for a given jurisdiction and entity, and it also allows you to compare across points in time. And so if you do have a more complex apportionment process with a lot of different maybe individuals or teams working with that data, this allows you to understand what a particular person might have been working with at a point in time, as well as maybe changes that were made in the system. So very useful from an audit trail and a audit defense perspective. Finally, what I would note here is the power of OSA's integration with other ONESOURCE modules. And so this allows a direct push of apportionment data to OIT, which is very helpful, but as we've noted, there are other ways to accomplish that. But this also allows a push of apportionment data to ONESOURCE tax provision and ONESOURCE estimated payments. So very, very handy solution, one that we have a number of clients that have been very satisfied with, and really for their use cases. And so depending on your apportionment complexity and kind of how you're using your apportionment data throughout the rest of your tax life cycle, strongly encourage looking at OSA as a possible part of that solution architecture. And maybe just a couple of maybe just a quick pull-in question. So I guess is your current apportionment process a pain point? And really we usually see a couple of responses. No, we've got it covered. If you do, that's awesome, great. Yeah, it could be better. And then sometimes we do occasionally hear, oh, the humanity. So take a look. Would appreciate give you a couple of seconds to choose. All right. Okay. So let's talk about Alteryx. So Alteryx is one of those applications that has actually been around for some time, but within the finance and accounting world, it has really kind of taken that world by storm in the last probably 5 to 7 years. It is really about the time frame it's been out. And so really at its core, it's a powerful data transformation application. It really focuses on allowing you to normalize, aggregate, and manipulate data in a way that's scalable and repeatable. And so, with that in mind, it also allows you to provide a Visio-like view of your data from start to finish. It is, in my experience, it is a transformative application, and it is so extraordinarily flexible that it can fit into pretty much any process in a variety of different ways. And so, there are certainly a number of other sessions at Synergy that will talk about Alteryx in much more depth. We wanted to broach this topic around state compliance automation because Alteryx, or a solution like Alteryx, is oftentimes part of these discussions. And so what we wanted to introduce was the concept, I think 2 key concepts in addition to just what it is and how it might fit in high level. But one is that we often see Alteryx being paired with advanced modeling capabilities and other applications to solve complex problems. So the obvious example here is state apportionment, and using either Alteryx by itself or Alteryx with maybe Power Excel or another enabling application to help address problems in your apportionment process. So a very powerful solution and a very powerful complement. And I think with that concept of it being a complement, I would also throw out its ability to integrate with ONESOURCE. And so in the current state, direct integration is a little limited, but Alteryx is useful for working with any of the import and export enablers that we've talked about already. And so if you think about data cleansing and aggregation, working with manipulation of your data as it comes out of source systems, Alteryx is a very natural complement to any one of those tasks. The other thing I would throw out there is that really as Thomson's capabilities and as the ONESOURCE connectors evolve, really the sky's the limit when it comes to ONESOURCE integration. And so would just encourage everybody, even if you're familiar with Alteryx, or if you haven't seen it at all, you've never, this is the first time you're hearing the word, would strongly encourage you to consider an application like Alteryx as part of your discussions to see if maybe there's a way it can be used. And Zubin, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with everything you said. The one thing I would, that I've seen most used for Alteryx is really thinking of the pain points and where you guys are spending a lot of time, where you're hours upon hours just sifting through data or formatting it and getting into the right area. Like, where are you guys spending that time? And that's something that Alteryx can help, within a couple of iterations of thinking of how the data needs to work. It can save hours upon hours of just not needing to work through data the same way that we typically would, just manually combining files or adding two different things together from different sources, or there's just a whole different ways to use this tool. And that's definitely how I would think through it, is like, where are you guys spending a lot of your time? Are there any benefits to trying to automate some of that? And this at least gives you a way to audit to see how you're working through that data, or how Alteryx is working through that data, and gives you that insight into that. So you always know what the inputs are, what process you're running through that, and then what your outputs are going to be. And it's all visible. It's not, with this black box of, I don't know what's happening to the data, and you can't audit it at any point. There is that capability to see that.
Yep. All right.
All right, next polling question. So how familiar are you with Alteryx? What is Alteryx? Or you're a novice, you're quite advanced, and you just build workflows on the weekend for fun?
What I haven't mentioned is that I actually threw in that fourth option, because that's what I do. Saturday afternoon, nothing better to do. I just sit there and build workflows. I'm kidding. I'm not quite there.
I'm quietly judging you, Nate. All right.
All right. Well, guys, again, we're in the home stretch. Really, how do we bring this all together? And the way I like to think about this is really to ask the question of, how do you eat an elephant? It's a big task. It's a lot to get your hands, wrapped around, right? And we'll come back to that. We'll answer that question here in a minute. We wanted to walk through, maybe a sample architecture, and this, the language here, really focuses on state apportionment as you read through it. But really, as you look at this, you're going to see that each of these points and steps really can be generalized to most aspects of the state compliance process. And so really our sample architecture, just at its core, if we start with our data, we're gathering our data, we're doing some data cleansing, and really every star on here represents kind of a potential integration point between applications, between enabling technologies. Once that data is aggregated, we bring it in and we reconcile it to our other return information. We also oftentimes will have master data lists that we're reading off of to kind of control information that flows through our process. From there, we'll apply some logic and we'll do some unitary calculations to get to our combined totals. And then oftentimes what we'll see, because the level of detail is different between compliance and maybe other purposes like provision, management reporting, and modeling and planning, is we'll oftentimes see a bifurcation in our data and our architecture. We'll bring in import templates with data at a certain level of granularity for compliance, but then we really do need something that will give us logic and unitary and combined calculations for all these other purposes. And so just wanted to use this as an opportunity to kind of spark some ideas. Where are you seeing pain points in this process? And really there should be a red star right in the middle there as well, because that's also an integration point oftentimes between possible solutions. So just wanted to give a couple of ideas before we get to our wrap up. One potential architecture is to look at each one of these as an area of focus and a possible solution. So one architecture would be using an application like ONESOURCE Data Flow and Workflow Manager to handle your tax packages and bring that information in and do some data cleansing for you. And then using potentially something like Alteryx for data cleansing, and then potentially using ONESOURCE State Apportionment to handle your aggregation, your reconciliation, sourcing analyses, and logic, and then kind of bringing that all together, including the import templates and kind of that push for compliance. So that's just one possible architecture. Another that we've seen is focusing on Alteryx for data cleansing, or again an application kind of like it, and then maybe using an advanced model, a bespoke model that incorporates maybe Alteryx and Power Excel to handle your reconciliation, your logic and unitary calculations, and your reporting, and then using the import templates and the native OIT functionality that we've talked about for compliance, and really also for OTP, for financial statement reporting. So just wanted to show a couple of examples just to kind of give you maybe some ways to visualize your process. So I think, from my perspective, the answer to that question that we asked a couple minutes ago, by the way, is one bite at a time. And so it's very easy to be overwhelmed, I think, when we start talking about this, and it's very easy to think also that we have to kind of try and do everything at once, and really, especially with the state compliance process, one of the things I enjoy about working with it is that you can tackle problems one at a time. And just because you try something one year doesn't mean you can't try something in addition in the following year. The other thing I would add is that every technology that we've talked about has strengths and limitations. So what's right for you is going to depend on your company's profile, your priorities as a tax department, and your risk factors, and your capabilities, and what you can support. The other thing I would say in the state compliance world is that past implementation history matters. But it's not destiny. And so a lot of times we talk to clients who have tried something previously and it didn't really work the way that they wanted or expected, and we would encourage people in that position to really try and keep an open mind and think about maybe re-examining technologies they may have already tried to use in a prior period. So the other thing I would say is just needs change over time, and what works today may not be appropriate in a few years, and vice versa. Capabilities are evolving, and it really is a very exciting time to be working in compliance automation generally, and especially in the state area. So and the only thing I would throw out there is the importance of deciding on a strategy and a timeline. If you don't know kind of what you're working with and what your timeline is, it's very hard to execute successfully on it. So, Zubin, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Nate. It's just one big thing is really taking a look at your current process and thinking of where you can do this one bite at a time, right? As you're taking a look at your current process and then breaking that down into, all right, how can I tackle this one at a time, and putting that through a lens of I'm going to use these specific tools to enable me to at least clean this up in year one, in year two maybe tackle something else. Definitely different myriad of ways of approaching this. So definitely think of looking at your current process, as Nate said, where are the pain points. Right now you guys are still probably working through some state returns. Where are your pain points? What of any of the native functionality or any of the Alteryx solutions or even the data connection could be used to alleviate some of those pain points? And then, what are you going to tackle first to kind of, what's the biggest bite you want to take at this moment?
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you for your time. Please remember to complete the evaluation, and we really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.